Welcome back to the Kingdom Manifesto. Over the past couple of weeks, Steve has been providing us with an introduction to some of Jesus' greatest teaching, found in Matthew chapters 5 to 7. As we've said already, there is some debate over whether this was one singular block of teaching or a collection of teaching that Matthew has drawn together in these chapters. In all likelihood, these are things that Jesus said many, many times over during the course of the 3 years that he was a travelling preacher. And I can say that with some confidence because I know most of what I'm going to tell you today isn't going to be remembered tomorrow. And that's okay. There's no judgment. We're just not good at retaining information. Our brains don't work that way. They've been rotted by short format media. We need to be told things over and over again before they properly begin to sink in. That's why you'll often hear us repeating the same sorts of phrases again and again in this church, because repetition leads to retention. And, sometimes we just can't think of anything new to say. So I think Jesus probably wandered from village to village, town to town, performing miracles, gathering crowds, and teaching them the very things that we see here in the Sermon on the Mount. Things like, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, be the light of the world, be a town built on a hill, hear these words of mine and put them into practice, like a wise man who built his house on the rock. In fact, I'm even willing to bet that the disciples knew the exact moment in the sermon when to get the teas and coffees ready. Tell the crash teams to start packing their things up. So it's likely Matthew 5 to 7 is a collection of Jesus' greatest hits, the sermons that hit hardest, that made the biggest impact on people as he travelled around. And that's not surprising that these sermons were the ones that were remembered, because even as we read these words today, 2,000 years later and 3,000 miles away, they're still so impactful, right? They cause us to think deeply. They challenge the way that we see the world. Like, how does Jesus' teaching on gouging out your eyes if it leads you to lust speak to us in a world that is saturated by sex? Even the church is wrestling with this idea. On the one side you have the American evangelicals who are campaigning against women wearing yoga pants, and on the other, ex-evangelicals talking about the trauma they faced being a part of purity culture. How does Jesus' teaching on turning the other cheek speak to us in a world that is very much driven by the maxim, an eye for an eye? Centuries-old conflicts continue to rage across our globe as nations claim what they believe is their birthright. Death giving birth to death in an endless cycle of vengeance and violence. We still don't know how to love our enemies. In these sermons, Jesus speaks of the folly of living for money and material wealth. How does that speak to us in a world where success is measured by our net worth? How does Jesus' teaching on giving to the needy speak to us in a world where refugees are used to score political points? I could go on. But the point is that this teaching has endured because it still speaks with such relevance today, such power and authority, if we let it. So we're going to use this teaching to remind us of what it is that we're contending for, to help us shift our thinking from the kingdom of man to the kingdom of God. And I encourage you, as you read these words for yourself, to ask the question, how does this speak to me today? Last week then we started looking at Jesus' Beatitudes in Matthew 5 verses 3 to 12, though we have to remember that Jesus never called them Beatitudes. That was a title that was added later on in the Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Bible, around the 4th century. And it's important to remember that because sometimes we can end up viewing this list as a complete list of those who are blessed in God's kingdom, the blessed attitudes, as some have come to call them. And that sort of puts us into this position of trying to emulate all of these attitudes for ourselves, which is okay for some of them. Like, we should definitely try to be more merciful, or those who strive for peace, but we probably shouldn't be those that are trying to mourn more or increase our persecution. Those are just things that happen to us, right? I think a better approach is to see this as Jesus pronouncing blessings over the various groups of people that were before him as he spoke. And what's interesting about that is that the blessings Jesus pronounces seem to be for those that nobody else would call blessed. He blesses those who are suffering, those on the edge, those who find themselves with increasingly fewer choices in life. Perhaps we might even say he blesses those who needed it most. For example, last week we looked at Jesus' blessing for those who are poor in spirit, those who are at the end of their rope, like butter scraped over too much bread, as Bilbo Baggins would say. Jesus blesses them and offers them the kingdom of heaven. And we also looked at those who mourn, those who have suffered great loss in their life and endured great sadness, those who have had the floor pulled out from underneath them. Again, Jesus blesses them and he offers them comfort. It's almost as though he is selecting those before him who have experienced very little blessing of late. Maybe even those who had come to believe they were cursed by God, not blessed by him. So who's next in line? Who else is in this crowd, or one of the other crowds that Jesus spoke to, that needed blessing? Well, the next group that Jesus speaks to in verse 3 are the meek. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Now, I don't know what comes to mind when you think of being meek. It's not a word that we use very often these days, is it? And unfortunately, the Greek word that's used here is one of those finicky little words that are difficult to translate. There's no perfect translation. Some translations say humble instead of meek. Others say gentle. Still others have suggested that Jesus is blessing those who are without power. He may even be quoting Psalm 37, where King David pens this acrostic poem to encourage the nation. He writes, "A little while and the wicked will be no more. Though you look for them, they will not be found, but the meek will inherit the land and enjoy peace and prosperity." Remember, Jesus was speaking to a predominantly Jewish audience who would have known this particular psalm well. And if we think back to what Steve shared with us last week about the political situation in the first century, the Jewish nation understood themselves as those whose power and agency had been removed from them. Sure, they had client kings and were allowed certain freedoms, but the land wasn't theirs, and there was very little peace and prosperity, at least as they would have understood it. The thing is with being meek and powerless is that it's not always a choice. Through oppression and control, and through routinely having your voice silenced by those in power, you can end up living in fear for your life. And over the centuries we have seen this happen time and time again, through systems of patriarchy that have been designed to silence women, through systemic racist policies that deny basic human rights to certain groups of people, through insults and slurs and propaganda that is designed to convince us that some people are worth more than others. The word meek contains within it this idea of power, but a power that has ultimately been brought under control. As Christians, we are, of course, encouraged to lay down our rights for the sake of others, just as Jesus did. In fact, we might even say that Jesus chose to be meek for us, as it says in Philippians 2. But I wonder, who are the meek in our world today? And what choice do they have in the matter? The next group of people Jesus blesses are a little easier to understand. In verse 6, he says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." Who are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness? Well, in Scripture, the idea of righteousness and justice are intrinsically linked. In order to be right with God, we need to be justified before him, washed free from the mistakes of the past. In 2 Corinthians 5, verse 21, Paul writes of Jesus, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God, might be made right with God. And here Jesus seems to be speaking to those who are desiring to be right with God, those who hunger and thirst for it. There's a sense of urgency. You know, when you're thirsty or hungry, nothing else matters, right? I mean, maybe that's just me. I certainly someone who suffers with getting a little hangry from time to time. But I think that those who hunger and thirst for righteousness for themselves are often looking for it in the world too. Again, if we return to Psalm 37 and read on a bit, it says, the wicked plot in and against the righteous and gnash their teeth at them, but the Lord laughs at the wicked, for he knows their day is coming. The wicked draw the sword and bend the bow and bring down the poor and needy to slay those whose ways are upright, but their swords will pierce their own hearts and their bows will be broken. Better the little that the righteous have than the wealth of many wicked, for the power of the wicked will be broken, but the Lord upholds the righteous. If we look around our world today, there are countless examples of injustice and wickedness. Those who act in ways contrary to God's will, they no longer use swords or bows, but drones and missiles. But we can still recognize the plight of the poor and the needy, can't we? We can still see the many acts of violence and hatred and harm done to those who have done nothing to deserve it. Often, when we look around, it can feel futile to continue to contend for good in a world that is so often marked by evil. And we can even find ourselves developing a kind of apathy towards the suffering of others, particularly when that suffering doesn't directly impact us. But Jesus wants us to know that the struggle for righteousness is not without reward, even if that sort of feels like a stick of celery when what we want most is a roast dinner. Then Jesus moves on to bless another group. In verse 7, he says, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy." Another word for mercy might be compassion, the ability to recognize and empathize with the needs of others. Compassion literally means to suffer together. But mercy goes further, because mercy is actually about doing something to alleviate the suffering of others, even at great cost to ourselves. Jesus told a parable, a story about this in Matthew 18, when he was being asked about forgiveness. He said, "The kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. He began the settlement. A man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. 'Be patient with me,' he begged, 'and I will pay back everything.' Then the servant's master took pity on him, cancelled the debt, and let him go. He had compassion for him, and he showed him mercy, even though it meant the king would never see the 10,000 bags of gold that were rightfully his. But his desire to alleviate the suffering of his servant outweighed his need for recompense. Sadly, though, in the story, the servant is unaffected by the king's actions and ends up treating another very, very poorly without a hint of mercy, which doesn't work out all that well for him in the end. In the story, the debt that is owed is financial, but not all debts are. Sometimes showing mercy is about releasing somebody that we're holding in unforgiveness. Sometimes it's about letting go of an expectation we had of someone, or letting them know we're not disappointed in them, or even giving them the opportunity to try again. Sometimes mercy is about showing kindness to those who have offended us, or perhaps even hurt us in the past. Again, think about the context of the first century for the Jewish people who were living under the occupation of Rome. There must have been so much that they needed to let go of. Their national identity, their ability to govern themselves, the oppression they faced on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes people don't owe us anything, but we can still show mercy by helping those who are hurting, sharing with the needy, comforting the lonely, lifting up the downtrodden, and defending the weak. I know we talk about this verse a lot in this church, but notice how Micah 6:8 encapsulates these three groups perfectly. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, hunger and thirst for righteousness, to love mercy and be those who show mercy, and to walk humbly, to relinquish power with your God. So these are the next three groups that Jesus chooses to bless or encourage. And in each case, that encouragement looks a little bit different, doesn't it? To the meek, he offers the earth, in line with Psalm 37. To those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, he offers satisfaction, fulfillment of their deepest longings. And to the merciful, he offers mercy. I wonder, why does he offer these particular encouragements? Perhaps what Jesus is doing is blessing each group with the very thing that they lack. Maybe he's saying to them, I know what you've given up. I know what you've endured. I see how you've suffered. And I want you to know that in my kingdom, it's not going to be that way. You know, the meek had suffered by not getting all that they deserved. They had relinquished power and control. They had needed to learn to be content with their lot. In some cases, knowing that others had taken from them what was rightfully theirs. And so Jesus says to them, you get to inherit the earth. All that was given up or stolen from you will be restored to you. Those who hunger and thirst for righteousness had learned to live with being unsatisfied, as they saw the magnitude of injustice in the world around them, and yet they chose to continue to contend for good despite their exhaustion, despite their discomfort, despite them being hungry most of the time. And so Jesus says to them, you will be filled. In my kingdom, it's going to be righteousness for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And the merciful had needed to let go of the debts owed to them in order to show compassion to those who were suffering. They'd put aside their own needs, their own wants in favour of the other. And so Jesus says to them, the mercy that you've shown to others will be shown to you. And that's beautiful. To be seen by Jesus, to receive that comfort, that blessing from him. But I think this leads us to another question, maybe an even bigger one, namely, when? When will the meek inherit the earth? When will those who hunger and thirst for righteousness be filled? When will the merciful be shown mercy? Indeed, when will those who were poor in spirit receive the kingdom of heaven, or those who mourn be comforted? Is it going to be in this life or the next? I think my answer to that question is yes. Because the kingdom of heaven is both now and not yet. It's both happening and yet to happen. Jesus has rescued us and will continue to rescue us. So when Jesus speaks of the blessings of his kingdom, he is both telling us how it will be in the end and what it is we're striving for now. Remember that prayer that he teaches his followers in the next chapter. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. In heaven, God's will is already done, of course, otherwise it wouldn't be heaven, but it's our job to be those who bring heaven to earth. Which means that when Jesus tells us that the meek will be blessed, we have a responsibility to be that blessing. Just like we have a responsibility to give the kingdom to those who are poor in spirit, to comfort those who mourn, to bring about righteousness in our world, and to show mercy to all, just like Jesus did. One of the things that winds me up about social media is when people respond with thoughts and prayers. Not because I'm doubting the earnestness of their prayers, far from it, but because actually I think we are called to do more than just pray. As James writes, suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and be well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? We have to remember that we're not just called to pronounce blessings, we're called to be those blessings for others. So what I think we need to ask ourselves is this: who is it that needs blessing in our community? If Jesus stood in the centre of our town and looked around, who would he choose to bless? And to help you think about that, I want to read you an excerpt from one of my favourite Christian authors, Nadia Bolz-Weber. In her book Accidental Saints, she does exactly that. She imagines those who Jesus might bless today. She writes, blessed are those who doubt, those who aren't sure, who can still be surprised. Blessed are those who are spiritually impoverished and therefore not so certain about everything that they can no longer take in new information. Blessed are those who have nothing to offer. Blessed are the children who natter through communion. Blessed are the poor in spirit. You are of heaven, and Jesus blesses you. Blessed are those for whom death is not an abstraction. Blessed are those who have buried their loved ones, for whom tears could fill an ocean. Blessed are they who have loved enough to know what loss feels like. Blessed are the mothers of the miscarried. Blessed are those who don't have the luxury of taking things for granted anymore. Blessed are those who can't fall apart because they have to keep it together for everyone else. Blessed are the motherless, the alone, the ones for whom so much has been taken. Blessed are those who are still not over it yet. Blessed are those who mourn. You are of heaven, and Jesus blesses you. Blessed are those who no one else notices. The kids who sit alone at lunchtime. Those who wash the bedding in the hospital. The sex workers. The nighttime road gritters. Blessed are the losers and the babies and the parts of ourselves that are so small that don't want to make eye contact with a world in which winners are the only ones that matter. Blessed are the forgotten. Blessed are the closeted. Blessed are the unemployed, the unimpressive, the underrepresented. Blessed are the teens who have to figure out ways to hide the new cuts on their arms. Blessed are the meek. You are of heaven, and Jesus blesses you. Blessed are the wrongly accused, the ones who never catch a break, the ones for whom life is hard, for Jesus surrounded himself with people like them. Blessed are those without documentation. Blessed are the ones without lobbyists. Blessed are the foster kids and the trophy kids and the special education kids and every other kid who just wants to feel safe and loved. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are those who know there has to be more than this because they are right. Blessed are those who make terrible business decisions for the sake of other people. Blessed are those who are burnt out, like the social workers and the overworked teachers and the pro bono case takers. Blessed are the kids who step between the bullies and the weak. Blessed are those who hear that they've been forgiven. Blessed is everyone who has forgiven me when I didn't deserve it. Blessed are the merciful, for they totally get it. You know, every time we learn to offer blessing to those who have never felt it, every time we become that blessing for them, the kingdom of God comes to earth? Who is it that you might be a blessing for this week?